We develop these vipassana insights into the stream of our life history, primarily. We also develop insight into sounds, like you can have a perfect insight into a Nietzsche listening to the singing of a bird, for instance. But mostly, of course, as we sit here, as we sit down in formal meditation, the objects that come by are usually our past, and that is structured by this story we have developed about ourselves, the self-narrative. And the interesting thing is that even the Buddha had such a self-narrative. The only difference between his and other people's is that he did not identify with it. But you cannot help have a story, you cannot help having a story about yourself, no matter how enlightened you are. But as you purify your understanding of the nature of consciousness, the nature of thoughts, the nature of memory, and so on and so forth, that understanding is reflected, becomes integrated in your history about yourself. And that's very obvious when we hear about the Buddha's self-narrative, which he tells many times in the discourses in the Pali Canon. Buddha has this long story about himself from his childhood up to the time of his enlightenment. And he tells it many times, and with a few variations, dependent upon to whom he is narrating the story. He spent several years practicing asceticism, so when he is talking to ascetics, this part of his life, he elaborates on it in order to communicate his disillusioning with asceticism to these ascetics and convince them that their practice is of no purpose. He also spent a long time with yogis, some yogis, from whom he learned this samatha meditation. Samatha meditation is not at all peculiar to Buddhism. It's a part of the common Indian yoga tradition. And when he talks to yogis who are convinced that these samatha meditations lead to the realization of the eternal soul, then he elaborates on that part of his life. The Pali Canon is the oldest existing Buddhist scriptures at all. And as I mentioned the other day, they were orally transmitted for about 500 years before they were written down. And what characterized the handing down of these oral transmissions was that there was a great veneration for the tradition. Everything that was memorized about the Buddha was collected together and preserved and handed down. So you find a lot of more or less similar discourses, like the Buddha didn't change his teaching very much from the time of his enlightenment. He elaborated on the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths are the essence of his teaching, and there are various ways to expound these truths. So very many of the Buddhist discourses are just structured by these truths with slight variations, dependent upon to whom he's communicating this teaching, and where he does it, and so on. His discourses are structured as dialogues, very much like Plato's. Plato's dialogues about where he where he describes the teaching of Socrates. Maybe some of you remember the teaching of Socrates is always take place in conversation with some opponent. And the Buddhist discourses are spoken to either pupils who are asking the question or opponents who are arguing against him. And the Buddha lived at a time that spiritually was very rich. There was, in the 6th century, before our time reckoning, there was a tremendous interest in spiritual matters, much like the pre-Socratic area in the Greek culture. There were a lot of philosophers and a lot of schools of not only philosophers but also schools of yogis. And there was a lot of interchange of ideas between these various sects and schools and philosophers. And the Buddha, he was a predominating person in this whole cultural movement, and he wandered after his enlightenment all over northern India. Spent the rest 45 years of his life wandering around everywhere in the Ganges Valley between these spiritual centers and talking to people, instructing thousands and thousands of people in the Four Noble Truths, in the Noble Eightfold Path, which eventually enlightened people. There were thousands and thousands of people who were enlightened like himself. There's no difference between the enlightenment of a pupil of Buddha and his own enlightenment. There are some differences between their various other virtues, such as the quality of their compassion and their ability to teach and so on, but there's no difference between the purity of their liberation from ignorance, desire, thirst, and ill will. The enlightened one has eliminated these leaks through which the purity of consciousness leaks its purity. These leaks are just these 3 unwholesome root conditions: ignorance, ill will, and craving. And the mind of the enlightened one is established in this irreversible state of emancipation. And there was absolutely no difference between the enlightened disciples of the Buddha and the Buddha himself. And he established thousands of pupils in the state of enlightenment. Among others, his own wife, his ex-wife, as it were, and his son, and various other family members. His father attained one of the first stages of enlightenment just before he died. Part of Buddha's teaching was to refer to himself, to refer to his own experiences, how he had searched for truth, and what had made him search for truth. And he tells the story about his childhood. When he was 7 years old, he remembered life was very happy. Apparently he grew up in a well-to-do family. His father, he said, had 3 houses, one for each of the North Indian seasons. And so everything was happiness, except one thing, and that was that Siddhartha, which is Buddha's worldly name, became very aware of that people around him, they grew old, a face full of wrinkles, their hair grayed, and they fell ill, and then they died. And he was only 7 years old when this made a deep, deep impression on him, to the extent that he reflected that I myself am subject to old age, disease and death. I'm not exempt. Most of you probably know about the legend of the Buddha, according to which he grew up in abundant luxury, actually as a prince in a castle where everyone was forbidden to mention anything about aging and falling ill and dying. So when Siddhartha, Prince Siddhartha, according to this narrative, according to the legend, was 29 years old, he did not even know about this phenomena that people actually grow old and die. There was some sort of ruthless regime reigning in this castle. You know, when people they grew old, they were removed. And that was on his father, Siddhartha's father, who was a king. He did not want the son to become aware of these realities, because he feared he would renounce an worldly life and go out and seek the spiritual meaning of life if he became disillusioned with life as it is, as Siddhartha indeed became already when he was 7 years old, according to the more realistic narrative about him in the oldest layers of the canon. So the legend, which has this fantastic metaphoric story about Siddhartha not knowing anything about old age and death until he was 29 years old, and which was added to the canon about 500 years, is very different from the narrative the Buddha himself narrates time and again, how he grew up and became aware of the people around him got old and fell ill and died. And when he was 29 years old, then when his wife gave birth to his first son, that night he saw his son, he saw his wife with his son in her arms, and he didn't enter the room, and he said to the son, don't wake her up, but tell her to call the boy Rahula, and Rahula means chain. And then he left. He wandered away from his home, as he later narrated, in order to seek that which is not subject to old age, that which is not subject to illness, that which is not subject to dying, the deathless, as he called it. And he was 29 years old, and as I just said, he spent some years with some ascetics, practicing asceticism. There was a dominating idea at that time that you could attain liberation by tormenting the body. And Siddhartha became utterly disillusioned with this practice, and he nearly starved to death, and left the ascetics. And then he spent some time with some yogis and learned these jhanas, and was told that this is enlightenment, but he perceived that these jhanas are just very expanded states of the stream of consciousness. It's not a transcendental experience. So he left his yogi teachers, and then he was on his own again, and walked out the road. and came to Bodh Gaya, where I spent 6 years with my teacher. And sat down under a tree and made up his mind not to leave his seat before he had attained enlightenment. And in that night he realized the Four Noble Truths as an intuitive, direct experience. The existence of suffering, he penetrated that truth and understood it thoroughly, and the cause of suffering, and the elimination of the cause, and the path to the elimination of the cause. In the moment of enlightenment, all these four truths are understood simultaneously. In the approach, various aspects of them are understood and elaborated upon intuitively. But in the culminating disillusionment, the so-called 37 dharmas that lead to enlightenment sort of converge in one intuitive penetration of consciousness. And I mentioned the other day that it's very difficult to understand intellectually, but the disillusionment is really about consciousness itself. So consciousness simply falls away. And the Buddha, he talked very little about the transcendental, because it cannot be understood by language that is conditioned by the impermanent experience, and that is all language. We have no idea of what permanency is. We have an idea of what the hallucination of permanency is, that's something else. But we have no idea of what permanency is. We may think that the Mount Everest is quite permanent, but Mount Everest will turn to dust one day. We may think that the universe is permanent, but the universe ceases to exist one day. It isn't permanent. And nirvana is that which, to paraphrase the Buddha, on the few occasions when he talks about it, nirvana is that where there is no arising, there is no changing into otherwiseness, and there is no cessation. Just the opposite of what we are looking into in our meditation. Just the opposite of the insight we are cultivating. In object after object, it's arising, it's changing, and it's cessation. In order to become disillusioned with it, so we can let go of our holding on to it, of our reaction. And when this disillusionment culminates, we can let go of everything, of the impermanence, let go of the stream. First we have to purify our understanding of the stream, and in order for us to let go of it on the most subtle level. And the Buddha said also, even if vast numbers of beings, they enter nirvana, it has no influence on nirvana. And he calls it the deathless, the birthless, the refuge, the sure, the happiness, the pure happiness, and other auspicious terms like that. The goal, the irreversible goal. So the end of his narrative is also always about his enlightenment experience when he was 35 years old and sat under the tree in Bodh Gaya. And that's very rare for a spiritual person to talk about his deepest realization. In most, in all the traditions I have knowledge of, this is always some deep mystery. But there's nothing, actually, the mystery in the case of Buddha's enlightenment is that his enlightenment cannot be understood intellectually, but he's prepared to talk about how you get there, because he wants you to go there. And his enlightenment is not something you reveal to him. It's not something that just happens to him. It's something you work for in order to realize. And the Buddha has a very detailed map for that journey. He had a perfect understanding of how he achieved enlightenment. And that's why he spent the rest of his life teaching others to embark on that journey. So this story the Buddha had about himself is really a very wonderful story. It's the essence of wisdom. A child grows up, understands the impermanence of life. A young man in whom this knowledge culminates, leave his home in order to search for that which is not subjected to old age, disease, death, impermanence, and he finds it. He finds the deathless and becomes enlightened. It's a wonderful story. That's the self-narrative Buddha ended up with. It was, of course, very different at the start of his journey. But the story about himself he ended up with reflects his wisdom, reflects his enlightenment. And in the same way, as we develop insights, the story we have about ourselves will change, will accordingly become transformed, and to an increasing extent reflect our understanding of momentariness, of suffering, and of causelessness.